I'm here with the Reverend Dr. Luke A. Powery, Dean of Duke University Chapel and Associate Professor of Homiletics at Duke Divinity School. Prior to his appointment at Duke, he served as the Perry and Georgia Engel Assistant Professor of Homiletics at Princeton Theological Seminary. His teaching and research interests are located at the intersection of preaching, worship, pneumatology, and culture, particularly expressions of the African diaspora. He has written 2 books titled Spirit Speech, Lament and Celebration in Preaching, and Dem Dry Bones, Preaching, Death, and Hope, and is currently working on a co-authored introductory textbook on preaching, Ways of the World, Learning to Preach for Your Time and Place, as well as 2 devotional books of meditations on the spirituals for the liturgical seasons of Advent and Lent. In 2008, the African American Pulpit named him one of 20 outstanding black ministers under the age of 40 who are helping shape the future direction of the church. And in 2014, he was inducted into the Martin Luther King Jr. Collegium of Scholars at Morehouse College. Thank you, Luke, for joining us today.
Thank you. Good to be here.
As you know, Frederick Buechner will soon be turning 90 years old. Is there anything you would like to wish him for this great milestone?
Sure, Reverend Buechner. First, I want to say happy birthday to you. And I also want to leave you with a blessing that I leave with all undergraduates from Duke University who are seniors at the baccalaureate service. It's a blessing from the Hebrew Scriptures. And that's what I want to offer to you. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance upon you and give you peace. So happy birthday.
Well, thank you very much, Luke. I'm sure Mr. Buechner will appreciate that. Can you tell me how you first learned about his work?
I first came across his work when I entered seminary at Princeton Theological Seminary in the 90s as my world began to expand and thinking about the church historically, thinking about what preaching is across the world, and biblical studies and all of the various forms of criticism. It was in a general ministry class, which was a basic introduction to Christian ministry, but also in my preaching classes when I was introduced to the work of Frederick Buechner and his writings. So seminary was the door to his work.
What would you say most attracts you to his writing?
I think there are many things, but to focus on one thing, I would say it would be the vivid imagery that he uses in his writing. The words, in many ways, are like linguistic icons. They're portals, they're windows to a deeper reality, the truth that he talks about in much of his writing. And so for me to hear him say something like he did in a sermon at Duke Chapel in the 1980s, 1982, I believe it was, on a Palm Sunday, that sadness was in the air like dust, as an example. Or when he talks about Jesus and the imagery of a man who had a cauliflower ear or a ruptured spleen, yet somehow he is our healer. These words, these images really open up a door into a deeper reality of who God is and our own human experience.
How would you say that Mr. Buechner's writing has influenced your career?
I think his writings have particularly pointed me in the direction of the care of words. You know, I'm a professor of preaching. I preach regularly at Duke Chapel and in different institutions and churches across the nation. And he represents to me someone who understands what it means to be a steward of words, a caretaker of words, that words matter, even as we think about the Word who became flesh and lived among us. and they're not just flippant, but they mean something. And so for me, again, it's connected to the linguistic icons, and how they can be a window again into a deeper understanding of our own lives here on earth, but also into who God is.
Which of Mr. Buechner's books would you say has meant the most to you?
Without a doubt, it is telling the truth. The gospel as tragedy, comedy, and fairy tale. This notion that the gospel is bad news before it is good news, and that all of the tragedy, the comedy, the fairy tale, all of it is true. Without a doubt, is the book that has had the greatest influence on my thinking about the nature of the gospel and the nature of the preaching task.
Well, I think you're not alone in that. Many of the pastors and preaching professors and seminary faculty that I've spoken with share that view.
Yeah, I'm not surprised.
Has Mr. Buechner inspired any of the writing that you've done?
He has. Actually, his book, Telling the Truth, I would say in many ways has had a great influence on my book, Dem Dry Bones, Preaching Death and Hope. When I was working on that book, I was on a sabbatical and traveling back and forth between Princeton and New Haven. And I revisited Telling the Truth during that time. And this whole notion of holding on to the reality of human suffering and the truth of the way life is, and death as an experience of life, but also keeping the truth of what he calls the comedy and the fairy tale of what I talk about as hope, but really seeing the interrelationship of death and hope. Really seeing the interrelationship of tragedy and comedy and how all of this is really extraordinary, as he would say, and making the connections between that deeper understanding of the gospel, in my case and in my own work, with the rich homiletical tradition of the spirituals that we see connected to African American Christianity. So that book in particular really shaped my thinking around what it means to preach the gospel in the here and now.
More broadly speaking, what influence would you say Mr. Buechner has had on Christianity and the world at large?
In general, I would say that his writings, many of his sermons, I think, do this, his nonfiction work in particular, open up a wider view of what Christianity is, the Christian faith. So it provides a space for people who are believers or not to question, to doubt, to struggle, and to help people understand how that is also a part of the life of faith and also a part of Christian hope ultimately, and to be a truth teller. And I think he provides a way for others who may not have been churched, but who are seekers, who are, on the journey of life, to have a deeper understanding, perhaps, of what life is about and who God is and where do we find God in our struggles. And so I think he's one of the key people in this generation that has allowed us to see the relevance of the gospel in our world, to have a wide hearing.
Well, thank you for those insights. I realize this next question is difficult, but if you were to sum up Fred or Fred's writing in a few words, what would you say?
I would deem him to be the poet laureate of the gospel. I would say that he has found a way, has been gifted to use language in such a way that is a magnet to the gospel. And so to me, I see him as a poet laureate of the church.
That's a wonderful title. Thank you for that. Before we finish, is there anything else that you'd like to say?
No, I'm grateful for his life. I'm grateful for his gifts to the church and the broader world. And I wish him well on his 90th birthday.
Well, thank you again, Dr. Powery, for joining us today. We really appreciate your participating in this.
Thank you. Glad to be a part of the great cloud of witnesses.